Welcome to my channel. Let's look at the left ventricle. The left ventricle is the left lower chamber of the heart, and this is the left ventricle. I have done a lecture on the right ventricle and also the atria. You can go and check up those lectures so as to keep yourself updated. But for this class, we'll be looking at the left ventricle, and this is the left ventricle harrowed here in yellow. This is the left lower chamber of the heart. Just as the name implies, it is seen at the lower border of the heart and of course on the left part. What the left ventricle does is to pump oxygenated blood into the aorta. We know that on the left side of the heart is where we have oxygenated blood. In the left atrium is where oxygenated blood is received from the lungs. So oxygenated blood in the lungs is directed through the pulmonary vein, and the oxygenated blood is emptied into the left atrium, which then further pushes the blood into the left ventricle. It is from the left ventricle here that the blood that is oxygenated is then directed into the aorta, and this is the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. It is the aorta that then feeds the other arteries with oxygenated blood. Let's also further try to differentiate the left and the right ventricle. The left ventricle, we said that this is the left ventricle here. The left ventricle is larger in terms of capacity than the right ventricle. So the quantity of blood that the left ventricle can accommodate is more than what the right ventricle can accommodate. And this we can justify because the blood that is oxygenated is pushed into the aorta, which is then used to supply the different body organs. You can imagine the number of organs that the aorta will be supplying with oxygenated blood. While in the right ventricle, deoxygenated blood is pushed into the pulmonary artery, which then drives the blood that is deoxygenated into the lungs where it will be oxygenated. So for the right ventricle, the oxygenated blood is just directed into the lungs only, while in the left ventricle, it is directed into the aorta, which is used to feed the different body organs with oxygen and also nutrients. So you can see that for the left ventricle, it is feeding more organs, while the right ventricle is feeding just the lungs. So the capacity of the left ventricle is larger than the right ventricle, and this we can use to justify that. Also, if you look at the length of the left ventricle, the length of the left ventricle is shorter, but transversely it is wider. But all in all, the capacity of the left ventricle is larger than what is presented on the right ventricle. And also, because on the left ventricle, oxygenated blood is pushed into the aorta, which will be used to supply the different body organs, while in the right ventricle, the blood that is deoxygenated is just directed into one organ, which is the lungs. So we should expect that the pressure on the left ventricle will be more than what will be exerted on the right ventricle. So the pressure on the left ventricle is higher than what is presented on the right ventricle. That is another difference. And this is the left ventricle, this is the right ventricle. The pressure that is needed to be exerted in the left ventricle will be more than what is needed in the right ventricle, because the left ventricle is servicing the different body organs through the aorta, while the right ventricle is just servicing the lungs by pumping deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary artery. Also, another difference that we want to highlight is the thickness of their wall. The wall of the left ventricle is thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. This is the wall of the left ventricle. You can see that it appears to be thicker here. And this we can also justify with the fact that from the left ventricle, more pressure is needed so as to drive oxygenated blood into the aorta that will be used to supply the different arteries in the body with oxygen and nutrients. So in the left ventricle, we need more momentum in terms of energy that needs to be exerted because it is supplying a number of organs in the body. So the wall of the left ventricle is thicker so as to be able to complement with this action of being able to push blood into the aorta under a very high pressure, because it is going to be feeding a number of organs in the body. While on the right ventricle, it is just feeding the lungs through the pulmonary artery. So the pressure here needs not to be as high as what is expected or needed in the left ventricle. The wall of the left ventricle is thicker. As a matter of fact, the wall of the left ventricle is the thickest of all the four chambers of the heart. So it is good for us to be able to establish the differences between the right and the left ventricles. So going further on the external features, if you look at the left ventricle on the outside, So we can say that the left ventricle forms the apex of the heart. Remember our lecture on the heart. If you've not also checked that lecture up, please kindly go and do so. We talked about the base and also the apex of the heart. This is the apex of the heart. And this region that is termed the apex of the heart is formed by the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is what forms the apex of the heart on the outside. And of course, it is directed to the left side of the middle medial sternum. Also, the left ventricle forms part of the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. This is the diaphragmatic surface of the heart at the inferior part. The diaphragmatic surface of the heart is the surface of the heart through which it connects with the diaphragm. And this surface is formed by the left ventricle. So this is the left ventricle where it forms the diaphragmatic surface. That's why the remaining part of the diaphragmatic surface is formed by the right ventricle. So these two ventricles is what form the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. So the left ventricle forms part of the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. Also, it forms part of the sternocostal surface of the heart. The sternocostal surface of the heart is the anterior region of the heart, or the anterior surface of the heart, where it connects with the sternum and also the costal cartilages. So this is the sternocostal surface. The bulk of the sternocostal surface is formed by the right ventricle. If you look at this image here, this is what is clearly shown. This is the right ventricle, and this forms the bulk of the sternocostal surface. While on the right side, we have the right atrium. On the left side, we have the left ventricle. So the left ventricle is seen to form part of the sternocostal surface of the heart. So we can see on the external surface, the different regions of the heart formed by the left ventricle. The apex of the heart is formed by the left ventricle, while part of the diaphragmatic surface and also the sternocostal surface are formed by the left ventricle. So it's also good for us to know this. So going further on the external features of the heart, now let's go to the groove. The left ventricle is also seen to form grooves around the external configuration of the heart. So we have the left atrioventricular groove. The left atrioventricular groove is the groove that is seen between the left atrium and the left ventricle. This is the left atrium here. Remember, we also did the lecture on the left atrium. If you've not checked that lecture, please also kindly go and do so as to keep yourself updated. The left atrium, we say, forms the base of the heart, and it is seen at the posterior part of the heart. So this is the left atrium here, arrowed in blue. So the left atrium, if you go more inferior from the left atrium, you have the left ventricle. So this is the left ventricle. So there is a groove that is created between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and this groove is called the left atrioventricular groove. This is the left atrioventricular groove, and this is what is harrowed here. This groove is not left open. The coronary sinus is seen to pass through the left atrioventricular groove, and this is what is seen here in blue. The coronary sinus is the largest venous drainage of the heart, and you see it passing through the left atrioventricular groove, and this is what is seen in this image. Also to add that the left atrioventricular groove also extends a bit to the anterior part, and this is what is seen in this image. This is part of the left atrium showing up here, while you have the left ventricle down here. So you see a groove also extending a bit to the anterior part, which is called the left atrioventricular groove. The left atrioventricular groove is coming from behind because bulk of the left atrium is seen at the posterior part. So you see it extending a bit to the anterior region of the heart. Then another groove that is seen is the interventricular groove. The interventricular groove, just as the name implies, you have the groove that is created between the right and the left ventricle, interventricular. We have two. We have anterior interventricular groove. This is the anterior interventricular groove. Remember, this is the sternocostal surface that is seen on the anterior part. So this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle. Between the right and the left ventricle, we have a groove that is created between these two chambers, and this is the anterior interventricular groove because it is seen in the anterior part. So we also have another groove that is seen behind the anterior interventricular groove, and this is the posterior interventricular groove. The posterior interventricular groove is seen behind, but it is seen to align with the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. So you see it facing the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. It is not posteriorly placed as the name implies. You need to tilt the heart backward for you to be able to see the posterior interventricular groove, but just for us to know that it aligns with the diaphragmatic surface of the heart. So you need to tilt it a bit, then you see the groove also separating the right ventricle from the left ventricle behind, and that is the posterior interventricular groove. So those are the grooves that are seen or created around the left ventricle. So let's further dive in on the internal configuration of the left ventricle. So let's look at the interiors of the left ventricles and some of the features that it presents. But first, let's subdivide the internal wall of the left ventricle into the sub-regions that is made up of. And the first one is the inflow part, or the bicuspid or the mitral valve complex. And this is the region highlighted here using this image down here. This is a complex because it's the arrangement of one structure linking up to the other. And this is the inflow region. Remember that oxygenated blood is delivered into the left atrium through the pulmonary vein, after which this oxygenated blood is then pushed into the left ventricle. So the region of the left ventricle that receives the blood that is oxygenated is the inflow region. This is also called the bicuspid or the mitral valve complex. So this region here is the inflow part. Looking at this image up here, this is the inflow part, because this is the left atrium and oxygenated blood is pushed from the left atrium into the left ventricle. So this region that is exposed is the inflow region or the inflow part of the left ventricle. It can also be referred to as the bicuspid or the mitral valve complex. And this is what is shown here. So blood that is oxygenated is pushed into this region first, after which we have the second region that is called the outflow part or the aortic vestibule. The outflow part or the aortic vestibule is not shown in this image because it's been chopped off. If you look at this image here, the sternocostal region or the anterior region of the heart is being chopped off so as to be able to expose the internal configuration of the heart. So talking about the left ventricle here, that is arrowed in blue, we see that the internal configuration of the left ventricle is exposed here. So the anterior region is chopped off because the outflow region or the aortic vestibule is located in the anterior part. So we cannot be able to see this region in the image up here. So going to the image down here, if you look at this region up here, this is the outflow part or the aortic vestibule. This is the region above here. You can see that it's located anterior or at the front of the inflow region. So this is the region arrowed here also in blue. Then it is good for us to note the parts that blood runs through after being released into the left ventricle. We know that oxygenated blood is released into the left ventricle, and the aim of this is to direct this blood that is oxygenated into the aorta, where it will be used to feed the different body organs with oxygen and also nutrients. So when this blood is delivered into the left ventricle, it takes an acute angulature for it to be directed into the aorta, considering the position of the aorta, and this is the part by which it runs. So oxygenated blood is released into the left ventricle and it takes this angulature before it is being driven into the aorta. It's good for us to note this. What this means is that there's going to be the need of high pressure for blood to be pushed into an angle that is less than 90 degrees before it can pass through the aorta for it to supply the different body organs, and that can be used to justify the thickness of the left ventricle so that more impact will be generated. As the left ventricle contracts, it's going to create intense pressure so as to be able to direct oxygenated blood into the aorta, considering the kind of angulature or path that the blood will need to run for it to be emptied into the aorta. So we are going to be taking each of the sub-regions of the left ventricle one after the other to see what they present. And the first region we'll be looking at is the inflow part or the bicuspid or the mitral valve complex. We talked about this region. That is the region that receives oxygenated blood from the left atrium. This is the left atrium. There's the left ventricle. So the first region where oxygenated blood is released into is the inflow region or the bicuspid valve complex. And what this complex contains include the bicuspid valve itself. The bicuspid valve is also referred to as the mitral valve. This is the bicuspid valve here, and it forms the border between the left atrium and also the left ventricle. So this is one of the components of the inflow part or the bicuspid valve complex of the left ventricle. So going further and looking at the configuration of the bicuspid valve, from the name bicuspid, it means it is a two-leaflet kind of valve. So you have a ring, this is the bicuspid ring, and on the ring, we have two leaflets attached to this ring. On the anterior part, we have the smaller anterior leaflets, and on the posterior part, we have a bigger posterior leaflet. So we have two leaflets, and that is why it is called the bicuspid. It has two cups, and these are the leaflets. We have the anterior smaller one and we have the posterior bigger one, and this is the way they are arranged, and this is the kind of configuration also that is presented here. You have the ring, the bicuspid ring, then you have the anterior leaflet and you have the posterior leaflet, and that is the kind of configuration that is presented by the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. The second structure that is seen to form the bicuspid or the mitral valve complex that is seen in the inflow region is the trabecular canal. The trabecular canal are round or irregular muscular ridges that are seen at the interior chamber of the ventricles. And using this image up here, this is the trabecular canal. You can see the ridges created within the interior wall of the left ventricle. Then we also have transformation of the trabecular canal. If you go back to our lecture on the right ventricle, we talked about the trabecular canal undergoing a number of transformations in the right ventricle. And we said that they are transformed into bridges, ridges, and also pillars. While in the left ventricle, this kind of configuration are not seen. The only type of transformation that is seen by the trabecular canal are the papillary muscles. So we have two papillary muscles. We have the anterior papillary muscle and we have the posterior papillary muscle. Unlike in the right ventricle where we have three, we have the anterior, the posterior, and the septal papillary muscle. But in the left ventricle, we have just two. So this is the anterior papillary muscle that is seen in the sternocostal surface. You can see the alignment of the anterior papillary muscle with the sternocostal surface, which is the anterior surface of the heart. And we have the second papillary muscle that is called the posterior papillary muscle. And this is seen to align with the diaphragmatic surface of the heart, which is the surface through which the heart is connected with the diaphragm. So we have two papillary muscles in the left ventricle when compared with the right ventricle where we have three papillary muscles. So we should also take note of this. Also going further, we have the chordae tendineae. The chordae tendineae are strong fibrous strings that is seen to connect the leaflets of the bicuspid valve with the papillary muscle. And this is what is seen here. You can see the string that is seen to connect the papillary muscle with the leaflets of the bicuspid valve. And this arrangement is what creates the bicuspid complex. You can see that the structures here are connected to one another. This kind of arrangement, we've tried to explain it on our lecture on the right ventricle, where they help to control or modulate the action of the bicuspid valve. When the papillary muscle contracts, there's going to be the contraction of the chordae tendineae, which will further also pull the leaflets of the bicuspid valve, thereby allowing it to open up. Then blood is then pushed from the left atrium down into the left ventricle. So this kind of arrangement is to help control the functionality of the bicuspid valve. It's also good for us to note that the trabecular canal, as presented within the interior wall of the left ventricle, we said that in the right ventricle, we have a number of transformations where they are being transformed into ridges, bridges, and also pillars, which include the papillary muscle. In the left ventricle, we did not see this kind of transformation. The only transformation that is only seen is the papillary muscle, and that is where we have the creation of the anterior and the posterior papillary muscle within the left ventricle. This is the trabecular canal. And in order to complement for this, we have more prominent trabecular canal in the left ventricle than in the right ventricle. It's also good for us to establish this. So going to the second sub-region of the left ventricle, which is the outflow part, this is also referred to as the aortic vestibule or the aortic orifice. And this is the region tagged here. It is seen above the outflow region or the bicuspid or the mitral valve complex. We already described this complex in our previous slides. So at the upper region of the inflow region is where we have the outflow region, and this is the region that is arrowed in blue. The outflow region is guided by the aortic valve. The aortic valve is a three-pocket-like or semilunar valve. And this is the kind of configuration that it presents. You can see that it presents a three-pocket-like structure seen at the emergence of the aorta. This is the aorta here through which oxygenated blood is pushed into for it to feed the different body organs. So at this head, you have the aortic valve, and the aortic valve is seen to present this kind of configuration, three pocket-like structure that opens into the aorta. It opens into the aorta so that when the left ventricle contracts, so that the blood can drive into the aorta, where it can be used to supply the different body organs. It is also important for us to note the placement of the outflow region. We already said that the outflow region is seen at the upper part of the inflow region. Apart from that, it is seen to be placed anteriorly and also directed towards the right of the bicuspid valve. This is the bicuspid valve here. If you look at it, it is seen anterior to it because of the kind of configuration that it presents in terms of its position. So for blood to be pushed from the left ventricle going to the aorta, it needs a higher pressure for it to direct blood into the aorta. So let's also add this, the orifices of the left ventricle. By now, we should know that the orifices of the left ventricles are two. We have two orifices, the bicuspid orifice. The bicuspid orifice is guided by the bicuspid valve, and this is seen at the entrance of the left ventricle. And this is the bicuspid valve here. Then another orifice is the aortic orifice, and this is the aortic orifice here, also arrowed in blue. This aortic orifice is guided by the aortic valve, and this is seen at the exit of the left ventricle. You can check our understanding of this lecture through the following question. And the first one is to describe the different regions of the left ventricle. This we have highlighted during our lecture. The second question is, the left ventricle is the thickest chamber of the heart. Can you please justify this? And the third question is to describe the grooves that are seen around the left ventricle. So thanks for watching. Let's meet again.